My truth is that not very much has changed. It looks better, it sounds better. There's opportunities like this that involve funds to help produce work, but we have a lot of work to do. I believe that the place that we live is extremely polarized, and there's probably more division than I've ever seen. I mean, there's an assault on everyone's rights, women's rights, gay rights, like voting rights, you name it, and there's some problematic thing happening right now, environmental rights, you know. And so I see myself in this space where I'm carefully chronicling my lived experience and all the things that impact me. The way that I've chosen to create the change that I'd like to see is to work with people who are alive and document their voices and their realities, and hopefully create a spectrum of stories from my community that shows the diversity within our community, you know, and that being in opposition to popular narratives about who we are.
What if this is all just a dream?
So my name's Michael Coppage. I live and work in Cincinnati. My work is titled Hands Behind Your Back. It's the third of an ambitious set of 12 bronze sculptures that I'd like to create from my 12 Commandments series. And it wouldn't be possible without a grant from ArtsWave. So the 12 Commandments are a series of bronze sculptures that highlight the power that is exerted over Black and brown bodies. Essentially, it's a series of police commands, and it's meant to highlight that even during times of compliance, it doesn't guarantee our safety. And so commandments like hands behind your back, get on your knees, show me your hands, drop your weapon, and all of the ones that we know will be represented in some way as a bronze casting. And there's a complimentary film to help people fill in the gaps, because I'm imagining and I'm wanting to create 12 sculptures, but right now I only have 3. The other piece about this particular body of work is to highlight the variance between moral law and man's law. 12 is slang for police, which is why it's titled the 12 Commandments, versus the 10 Commandments who teach us, you know, thou shalt not kill. And there's this 1 degree of variance that creates situations for Black and brown bodies that lead to the death of almost 2,000 people a year since the year 2000. So it's a significant amount of people who look like me who are losing their lives during what is considered, you know, routine stops and things like that. Well, I think the first grant inspired this new body of work because with the first grant, I created a project called Black Box, which highlighted nouns that we use contemporarily that are prefaced with the word black. So black heart, black sheep, black ice, black magic, black market, black male, black list, you know, every one of those words is negatively connoted. And, you know, before we ever talk about race in this country, before we even mature enough to talk about race, we learn about black. You know, we're encultured in this country to learn that roses are red and violets are blue and black is scary, right? And so when we meet a black person, all of those things that we've learned, we project onto that person. And, unfortunately, we as Black people have to sift and navigate our way through the gauntlet of other people's projections most of the time. So Black Box was a very kind of general overview kind of piece. But that leads into the 12 Commandments because I used all of the same gentlemen from the Black Box series to be in the film because I wanted to highlight how, when we're pulled over or when we interface with law enforcement, there's a projection that's made oftentimes onto us that makes us more dangerous to the person that we're interacting with, to the officer we're interacting with. Even though, we're nurses and we're teachers and we're fathers and we have families and all of these things that I try to drive home in the Black Box series. So as it relates to the sculptures, I thought it was the best idea for me to be present in the sculptures, like kind of the sacrificial lamb. I'm doing these very prolonged endurance poses, anywhere from 3 to 6.5 hours, where I'm essentially being brutalized. But the reality is I get to live through this experience. And by me performing, if that's even the right word, these kinds of poses, my hope is that it brings attention to like a normalized reality in our community that other communities really don't have to live with. They don't have to prepare for. There's not an etiquette to deal with it versus in our communities, there's an etiquette that we learned at a very young age for how to interface with law enforcement. And the bronze really helps elevate those stories because that material is something that's always been reserved for narratives about the elite, about war generals or whoever, whatever person of the day, like civically we thought were important. Because I think that these stories are important and because they seem to come at us so frequently and we've developed like a callous to them almost, and they're just like a footnote in a news cycle. Our lives are reduced to like a 4-second soundbite. I felt like I needed to do something that was a little bit more compelling to take the normalcy of this experience away and help show people why this is wrong, how this negatively impacts our communities, and how different the country that we live in really is, and what some of the experience looks like. And hopefully, the work will do its job and I'll be successful with that. I think the film was a dialectical behavioral intervention. I think it was a therapeutic intervention. I intentionally scored the film with a resting heart rate. And as we went further into the commands and the gentleman assumed the poses, the heart rate increased as a kind of a stand-in to highlight the element of fear that is playing out in a real case scenario. This is a 4-minute film. This is kind of like an average time length for this kind of experience. And as the heartbeat increases, I think viewers find themselves holding their breath or their heartbeat starts to pair with the score, and it creates an anxiety, in the viewer that creates an authentic connection to the person that's experiencing this in the film. And then in the end of the film, everyone gets shot and killed, right? And as they die, you feel yourself deflate a little bit, and it's a emotional blow that is ultimately a prompt of this particular behavioral therapeutic model meant to start an internal dialogue with the viewer that hopefully leads to an empathetic change of opinion, an empathetic change of perspective, and a more attuned awareness of what this actually feels like, because I'm making an assumption about my audience that most of them have never and will never experience this sort of thing in their lifetime, and I think it's really powerful, or at least the feedback that I've gotten from folks who feel comfortable sharing is that the work, it's doing its job, you know. So ArtsWave has an imperative to bridge cultural divides, and you know, my work, all of my work, none of my work is made for a Black audience, really, you know, because Black people understand this experience, we live it. You know, I'm preaching to the choir, and I think the work has the ability to be much more powerful. So I create the work to engage audiences that aren't from communities like mine, and I think that there is a deliberate intention in our country to socially distance Black people from everyone else. I mean, when I look at the narratives about who we are in music and in TV and the media, you know, they're always kind of trope heavy, and they're always kind of negatively charged, and there's a connection to gangs and violence and drugs and sex and all of this stuff, and it's a reduction of who we are. And if I'm seeing these images, and I live in a Black community, and it's hard to like navigate that, then you know, I'm imagining, you know, not really having a lot of authentic relationships with Black people, and seeing these images and how a monolith can be kind of chiseled out of all of the things I'm consuming. And I think my goal ultimately is to slice that monolith into thin little bite-sized pieces for audiences who have no connection to our community to have an entry point into our community, whether it's through lens-based work or bronze sculpture or textiles or whatever it is I'm choosing to use. It's a goal of mine to use the work in kind of this ambassador role to really engage with people in a meaningful way that doesn't prey on guilt or that doesn't really utilize anger, even though there's a lot of that too. You know, I have to really be present, and I have to really be intentional about the work that I'm creating so that I don't scare my audience away, or I don't hit them over the head with a bunch of stuff, you know, because I'm angry. And so there's a certain care and consideration that I think I'm using. And again, you know, from a therapeutic model standpoint, that's the approach. That's the appropriate approach. And I think that because I'm an artist, it's difficult for people to understand sometimes, like, why I'm taking it easy, because I am unapologetic, but I can be both. I can be unapologetically Black, and I can be straight to the point. But I also want to be considerate, because if we're trying to bridge a cultural divide, you can't do that through, you know, anger and through some of the you know, static feelings that live inside of me. So self-awareness is a huge part of it, understanding myself, what my intentions are, but also understanding how I'm being perceived, you know, before people even meet me. So it's a lot. It's a lot of layers, and you know, my brain's like an onion when I'm thinking about this stuff. But it's certainly worth all the effort and torture that I put myself through. My truth is that not very much has changed. It looks better. It sounds better. There's opportunities like this that involve funds to help produce work. But we have a lot of work to do. I believe that the place that we live is extremely polarized, and there's probably more division than I've ever seen. I mean, there's an assault on everyone's rights, women's rights, gay rights, like voting rights, you name it, and there's some problematic thing happening right now. Environmental rights, and so I see myself in this space where I'm carefully chronicling my lived experience and all the things that impact me. And over a career and over time, and when my time is up, I'm hoping that there is a history there kind of preserved in the amber that's like fresh, and that, it's not a history that we have to uncover. We're not. You don't have to be an anthropologist to go back and find this person and tell their history and not have them be a part of the story. The way that I've chosen to create the change that I'd like to see is to work with people who are alive and document their voices and their realities, and hopefully create a spectrum of stories from my community that shows the diversity within our community, and that being in opposition to popular narratives about who we are. Well, I don't think that people ultimately will understand our lived experience, but I just want to expose them to it so that they feel more closely connected, so they feel how we feel. Many times when we share our experience, it's met with dismissal. Well, all you have to do is listen. If you would have followed the orders, nothing would have happened. If it was me, I would. There's a need to diminish the experience, and when people are, whether they know it or not, when they're actively trying to diminish something that for you is an important and a thing that's potentially can consume you, someone like me has to find a more creative way to facilitate that conversation, because it doesn't go away. It just festers. It could potentially turn into a situation where I give up and I hurt someone, or I give up and I hurt myself. We live in a world where anything is possible now, and I've just found a creative solution to give people a peephole and a window that hopefully leads to a place of empathy. If I can get the weatherman to stop saying black ice, every weatherman across the country to stop saying black ice, then I help to eliminate part of a traumatic cycle that is kind of perpetually kicked down the road, right? If we can say black male, if we can replace black male with extort, if we can replace black cloud with storm cloud, if we could kind of tap into our language and use the words that describe the thing that we're talking about, maybe we can eliminate some of that fear and some of the projections that happen and some of the assumptions that are made, and like with these kind of social constructs that have been crafted for Blackness. I think that that's a very small ask, because it doesn't take any energy on the part of my audience other than to make a mental note like, oh, we're not gonna, well, you don't even have to say we're not gonna use that word. You can just say, you can just replace it. I remember growing up, right? My grandmother was a librarian and my great aunt. And I remember coming in the house and I was like, oh, I ain't doing something. And instead of saying, oh, we don't use that word, what they said was, what is ain't? And what they were saying is, you know, be more articulate, you know. And I said, well, I don't feel like, or there isn't, or whatever the switch was. And maybe that's a part of my grandmother and my great aunt that lives in me, where there are these words that raise a flag for me, because whether people in society realize it or not, we're continuing to kind of negatively brand and impact people who identify as Black through the use of these words. So if a parent makes a switch and they say, you know, well, you know, we're not a black sheep. They're just an outsider, or they're just an outcast, or something like that, or you know, that's not black ice. It's clear ice, and explain to them that it's just blacktop underneath. You know, blacktop is pretty neutral. You know, it makes sense, but there are ways that people can help me create the change, at least in our natural orbits, and the people we live with, we love, we work with. And it requires no money. It requires no real performative effort on their part that isn't true to them. It doesn't even require a conversation, really. It's just a switch that can be flipped that I think helps. I mean, I did a TED Talk a couple of years ago, and in the TED Talk, I said that, you know, we don't use colored in this country anymore. And that was, I would say, a ubiquitous term to describe Black people living in this country at once. But once we understood the ramifications of someone who we identified as color and the assumptions that came with it and all of the other things, we decided culturally to eliminate it, right? There was a cultural bridge that was built at a certain point in time where we collectively, as all communities, decided to eliminate that from our contemporary language. And so it doesn't really exist, except for maybe, you know, a much, 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 much older generation. And so we can do that same thing here. And it may take generations, but I have to believe that it's possible. And, you know, and it's an ask that I have for every audience, every person who comes, because, you know, I grew up using this language too, not understanding how it contributed to how I felt and what my experience was. So it's the easiest thing that any of us can do. And I always start there when I think about what I'm asking my viewers to do. I think this work is therapeutic in a couple of ways. The first way is personally, right? Everything that I make is something that I've carried around with me for my entire life. And if I'm being honest, I was afraid to talk about, because I realized very young that there wasn't really a healthy space to have a dialogue about this stuff. So I began making works about multiple facets of my experience, purging them from my body, crystallizing them in the form of an image or an object, and then being able to talk about them objectively without the emotional charge that's connected to it. So for me, it's been extremely therapeutic, because there's a certain amount of liberation that I now have and feel, and I'm divorced from carrying, you know, issues that frankly aren't mine, that were given to me, that I kind of volunteered to internalize. But I think it's also therapeutic for my audience, because I'm using a DBT model, a dialectical behavioral therapeutic model. Now, I'm not a therapist, but I worked in the mental health field for a very long time, and I still work in the mental health field. And one of the easiest entry points into this particular module is prompting people, and when you prompt someone, you create an environment where they're asking questions either to you or to themselves. They're having an internal dialogue, and that's the space where change is the most possible. There's some other things like focus and feel good and distraction are kind of these pillars of the module, and depending on what I'm making and what it's talking about, I use those too. But the prompting is the really important part, and that's why you see a lot of language in my work, because we all come to a piece with a lived experience, a whole life. And when we see a word that has some resonance with us, we confidently understand what it is. But, what you feel and think could be very different than what I feel and think. And so the work becomes a mirror that reflects back at the viewer, their values or their perspective about what this is, which could be in conflict with what the work is actually about. And, there's a conversation to be facilitated from there. So, if the goal of these works is to eliminate racism, because racism is a mental health issue, then we have to, in a therapeutic environment, name the thing, talk about the thing, regardless of how painful that might be, work through the thing so that we can move past it. And I don't think that we are there yet in our country. I think that we've named the thing and we're talking about the thing, but we're not doing anything to work through it. Instead, we're trying to legislate it away and silence the voices and shrink the voices. And so an opportunity like this to get funding helps to elevate the voice and puts resources behind projecting the voice and supporting the voice and creating environments where I'm engaging with people that I might not otherwise have access to. So it's a really beautiful timing. Well, I don't often get to see the fruits of my labor, so I don't know if I can, and I don't know if I can say what people feel and what the response is. But for the few that I've had, people are sometimes in tears, lots of goosebumps, a lot of, I just want to give you a hug and give you some love, and a lot of I didn't know, or I had no idea. And if we can move from the polar ends closer to the middle and we are closer together, I feel like naturally people start caring for you and caring for each other more, and it just becomes easier to figure out what your role is, because we didn't get to this space by ourselves. This was a team effort, and so it's going to take a team effort to really move out of this space. I think my mental health is shrouded, because these things are coming from me and being purged. I'm not really having any mental health residual kind of re-traumatization experiences, right? For me, it's cleansing. And once it's removed, it doesn't grow back. So from a personal standpoint, I'm in a position to help other people who might be struggling emotionally or behaviorally or mentally, or what that looks like. I understand that my work can also be traumatizing for people. And I think that on first glance, my work could appear to just be a part of this proliferation of Black images that show Black pain and what do they call it? They call it like trauma porn, right? But that's not what my work is. There's a portion of my work that is about that, because in order for me to move to spaces like where I'm telling narratives about Black relaxation and Black recreation and Black joy, I have to, address the thing that's preventing me from doing it. I have to work through that thing in order to move past that thing. So for me, there's an arc in my production, and the natural path was moving and working through the traumatic portions first, so that I can get to the real human portions of our experiences, and that's where I'm at currently. But the 12 Commandments is a pretty ambitious series of works, so it's constantly pulling me back from where I'm working today. If someone is being traumatized or re-traumatized, that's what happens in therapy. You have to kind of take the scab off and examine it and be in an uncomfortable place if you expect to be in the place that you're desiring ultimately. So I would argue that it's healthy to feel triggered. All right, it's healthy to feel discomfort when you're looking at my work, because the work is not superficial. It's not topical. It's not just shock value for the sake of shock value. It is intentional and deliberate, and it has a job. And every minute that it's in public, it's doing that job. And ultimately, that job is to help people heal. So I look at this particular project and the group of the body of works that this series is born from as my Just Us work, right? Like JUST, And where I'm at now is in the joyous, JOYUS phase. And that looks a great deal different, It's kind of mired in how do you center Blackness without painting their faces, without it being, a portrait of me or someone from my community. How do I connect through a human experience? And so what I'm exploring is a series of paintings now in this phase of my career, where I plan to show these at the end of next year. And there are a series of really beautifully colored, expressive paintings about the activity. So the activity could be roller skating or pool or cooking or swimming or some of the various recreational activities that I find myself or people in my community enjoying. The fleeting moment of joy that exists where all of these other things that I'm addressing in my work completely disappear, even if just momentarily. And I'm centering the activity. So instead of it being a Black person centered, it's the roller skates, and the roller skates are Black. All the subjects are painted Black, as a stand-in for the people, but it's not obvious at first glance. So anyone who enjoys roller skating will see this painting and connect to it. Anyone who enjoys playing cards will see this composition, and maybe they'll know the game, maybe they won't. But the game is, a game that, African Americans play primarily, and, Black people will see it and they'll get it, And maybe other people won't, but all they'll see is cards, and they'll know that this is a recreational activity, and this is something I used to do with my cousins, something I do with my family, something I do on vacation, swimming, kayaking, all of the things, right? And I don't know what all of the paintings look like, but I have 3 of them painted so far. I have a 4th one drawn out right now. I have ideas for the next 3. And I think that, I figured out a really beautiful way to tell stories about Black life without it necessarily highlighting the Black part of the experience, but more of just the humanity side of the experience, and normalizing, us doing the same things that everyone else does and enjoying the same things that everyone else does in the same way, in the same spaces, and also how the dissonance between how often we see images like this versus the trauma porn, right? So, I think that re-traumatization is healthy, because in any healing process, there's going to be a level of discomfort and a level of maybe trauma associated with it. But we have to be able to make the distinguish between the two. I think joy, personally, is a survival instinct. I think it is something that we find in the worst of worst case scenarios. It's singing, when we are feeling downtrodden. It's dancing when we feel the weight of the world resting on our shoulders. It's, all of those things that we find and that we identify that give us a reprieve, that a joy is a place of respite and on a very often treacherous path in this journey. I don't associate it to protest. When I'm thinking about the work that I'm making, I've heard it being referred to as a sign of protest, as revolutionary and the likes. And I don't disagree, but in my mind and in my work, joy is very much this space that's reserved to preserve your mind, preserve so that you don't lose yourself. It's a place where you tune your spirit up, and you come out of that experience, regardless of how fleeting, prepared to deal with the things that are just kind of waiting for you, when you walk out of your door every day. I want them to remember my name, and I want them to help me do this work in whatever way makes sense for them. I don't want much.